The sheets still smelled like her. That was the first thing I noticed when I woke up alone in that enormous hotel bed, blinking at a ceiling so high and white it felt like waking inside a cloud. The sheets smelled like her, that dark, complicated perfume she'd been wearing, something with cedar and white flowers, and something else I couldn't name, something I was already grieving at 6 a.m. before I fully understood she was gone. I lay there for a long moment, not moving. The storm that had stranded half the city the night before had finally broken, and thin gray light was seeping through the gap in the heavy curtains. Rain still tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was extraordinary. The kind of hotel suite I would never have booked on my own budget, the kind I'd only ever seen in magazines propped on waiting room tables. But I hadn't booked it. She had. The mysterious, quiet-voiced, achingly elegant woman I'd met downstairs in the bar when the city had gone dark around us and neither of us had anywhere safe to be. I reached across the bed. Cold. She'd been gone long enough that the warmth had left her side entirely. There was a note on the pillow. Just a note. No name, no number, no apology. Last night was the most honest thing I've permitted myself in years. I'm sorry I cannot stay. Take the coat. It will suit you better than it ever suited me. I read it 3 times. Then I sat up and looked around and found the coat draped over the armchair near the window. Floor length. Black. Cashmere so fine it barely existed beneath my fingertips. I pressed my face into it and inhaled, and there she was again. Cedar, white flowers, and that unnamed thing, and I felt something crack open in my chest in a way I couldn't explain and didn't particularly want to examine. Before I continue, if you enjoyed this story, I share lots of steamy, uncensored stories on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description. Details are in the description and comments. Be careful, it's very, very hot inside. I didn't know her name. I'd asked early in the night, somewhere between the second glass of wine and the moment the lights had come back on, and we'd both pretended not to notice. She'd tilted her head slightly and said, "Does it matter tonight?" And I'd said honestly, not really, because in that moment it genuinely hadn't. We'd talked for hours about ambition and exhaustion, about the particular loneliness of being capable in a world that keeps misreading your capability. She'd listened to me with a quality of attention I hadn't experienced before, the kind that made me feel both entirely seen and somehow braver than I actually was. She was older than me by at least a decade, composed in a way that looked effortless but wasn't, beautiful in the way that serious women who have survived something are beautiful. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that deepened when she almost smiled. She almost smiled quite often with me. When we'd finally moved from the bar to somewhere quieter, it was a mutual decision made without words, in the way that some decisions between two people happen below the level of language. And what followed, I won't pretend it was just physical, because it was never just that. She held me afterward like she was memorizing the weight of me, very still and deliberate, and I'd thought absurdly, this is someone who doesn't let herself do this very often. This is someone starving for ordinary gentleness. She was gone by morning, and I was lying in her sheets holding a cashmere coat and a 4-line note, and a hollow feeling I was going to have to carry by myself. I was 27 years old and I was 3 months behind on rent, and I had an interview in 4 days that might be the last real chance I had at salvaging the career I'd been quietly strangling myself to build. I folded the note. I put it in my jacket pocket. I folded the coat carefully over my arm and checked out of the room, which had already been paid for, and I went home to my small apartment and my roommate Nora, who took one look at me and said, "Okay, story, now. The whole thing, sit down." "There's nothing to tell," I said. "You're holding a coat worth more than our combined monthly income, and you have that face you get when something matters too much to say out loud." I sat down. I told her everything except the parts I needed to keep, the parts I pressed into my ribs and kept warm. Nora listened without interrupting, which was not something she was naturally inclined to do, which meant she understood the weight of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes," I said. "I'm always okay." "That's not what I asked." I looked at the coat folded across my lap. "I don't know." The next 4 days were practical and brutal. I revised my portfolio. I ironed my best blazer. I practiced answers to interview questions in the bathroom mirror while Nora shouted encouraging or occasionally cruel feedback from the hallway. The position was junior marketing strategist at Vale Meridian Group, a luxury media and technology company that had grown in the last decade from a boutique consultancy into something enormous and quietly powerful. They worked with fashion houses, cultural institutions, tech startups that wanted aesthetic legitimacy. They were the kind of company that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. Their name on your resume was a golden key. I needed that key. I needed it with the particular desperation of someone who has worked very hard and been repeatedly looked past and cannot afford, financially or emotionally, to be overlooked one more time. I wore the black cashmere coat to the interview. I know that sounds strange, but it felt like armor, and I needed armor. The Vale Meridian offices were in a tower of pale glass near the waterfront. The lobby smelled like a library and money. I signed in with a receptionist who had the posture of someone trained in selective invisibility and was led to a waiting room on the 14th floor. The chair I sat in probably cost more than my first car. I held my portfolio folder on my lap and breathed slowly and reminded myself that I was genuinely good at this, that I had ideas and instincts and a record of results that spoke clearly, regardless of who was in the room. Then the door to the boardroom opened and a woman walked in, and the world tilted 3 degrees and kept tilting. She was in a charcoal suit, beautifully cut. Her dark hair was pulled back smoothly. She moved through the room as if the space rearranged itself around her as a courtesy. She was speaking to someone as she entered, something curt and decisive about a campaign brief, and she hadn't yet looked at me. And for one extraordinary vertigo-inducing second I thought, no, that's not possible. That cannot be her. Then she looked up. Our eyes met across the boardroom table. She went absolutely perfectly still. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she sat down, opened a folder in front of her, and turned to the man beside her and said something in a low, even voice. Her face was composed. It was composed like a city skyline, structured, deliberate, designed to be looked at from a distance. Nothing in her expression acknowledged me in any way that the other people in the room could detect. But I watched her hands flatten against the table for just a moment of pressure. And I knew she recognized me. I knew she was the woman from the hotel, and I knew with a sliding certainty that this interview had just become the most complicated professional moment of my adult life. I got through it. I want to be clear about that. I got through it on my own terms, not through luck. The panel asked good questions and I answered them well. I had examples, numbers, concepts. I talked about the Vale Meridian brand voice in terms that were specific enough to show I'd done serious work, but original enough to show I wasn't just reciting their press materials back at them. I kept my voice steady, I kept my eyes professional and moved them around the table as though Seraphina Vale, that was the name I saw on the placard in front of her, Seraphina Vale, CEO, was simply one of 5 people in the room. She asked me one question directly, just one, near the end. What do you believe consumers are most afraid of losing? Her voice was exactly as I remembered it. Low, careful, with something underneath it that she kept suppressed. I looked at her. I said, the feeling that they were chosen. Not marketed to, but chosen. The best brands understand the difference. Something shifted behind her eyes. Just slightly. She looked back down at her folder. They thanked me. The panel stood. Seraphina did not stand. She was writing something, or appeared to be writing, and didn't acknowledge my departure. I shook 3 hands and walked out of that boardroom and got into the elevator alone and pressed my back against the wall of it and exhaled until my lungs ached. My phone buzzed on the way down. An unknown number, a text message containing 4 words, "Please stay in the building." I stared at it. The elevator reached the lobby. I stood in the middle of the marble floor with my portfolio folder and my borrowed coat and my thundering pulse, and decided, because I was tired of running from things, to stay. A woman appeared beside me within minutes. Tall, sleek, with the aura of someone who had decided that warmth was a liability. Later I would learn her name. Helena Cross, Chief Legal Officer of Vale Meridian Group. At the time, she simply introduced herself, handed me a card, and asked me to follow her. She took me to a small, glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor. Cool, bright, spare. There was a folder on the table already. She sat across from me and folded her hands and looked at me with the kind of professional neutrality that felt more hostile than outright aggression. "I want to be direct," she said. "Ms. Vale has told me you are a strong candidate for the strategist position. However, given the circumstances of a prior encounter between you, we feel it is in everyone's best interest to establish clear professional parameters." The folder slid toward me. I opened it. I read the header, confidentiality agreement and non-disclosure instrument, and below that, a figure, substantial. The kind of number that would not only resolve my rent situation but stabilize my life for years. I read every word. I am not someone who signs things without reading. The agreement stated, in the careful language of people who are afraid, that I would not discuss, imply, reference, or otherwise allude to any personal or social encounter with Serafina Vale predating my employment at the company. In exchange, a financial settlement and a confirmed offer of employment. Helena Cross watched me read. When I finished, I closed the folder and set it back on the table and looked at the wall for a moment because I needed to be accurate with myself. The money was real, and the job was real, and my need for both was also real. That night with Serafina was mine in the way that a rare and private thing belongs to the person it happened to, and signing this paper would not change that. It would not take the memory from my body. It would not undo the way she had looked at me in the dark with the storm against the windows. It would, however, make it a transaction. I signed. I dated it. I slid it back. Helena Cross was already opening another folder, the employment contract, when the door opened. Serafina walked in. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the signed agreement on the table. Then she looked at me. "Helena," she said, "give us a moment." The silence that followed Helena's departure was thorough and uncomfortable. Serafina didn't sit. She stood at the side of the table, not close enough to touch, and looked at the document. Then she looked at me with those eyes I had memorized in a hotel room in the dark, and for 1 second, before she could reassemble the mask, she looked genuinely pained. "You should know," she said, "that the agreement was meant to protect you," I said. "I know." A pause. "Yes. I'm not angry about being asked to sign it." I looked down at my hands. I stopped, found the right words. What happened that night wasn't a problem that needed to be managed. It wasn't a liability. And I think you know that. I think that's actually what you're afraid of. She said nothing for a very long time. Then quietly, "The employment offer stands. The position is yours if you want it." I looked at her. She was every inch the CEO, controlled, impenetrable, standing in that conference room like she'd been carved into the architecture of it, but her hands, resting at her sides, weren't quite still. "I want it," I said. "The position." She nodded once, walked to the door, paused with her back to me. "The coat suits you," she said, and left. That was how I started working at Vale Meridian Group. The following weeks were a deliberate act of professional sanity. I showed up. I worked. I introduced myself to my team, 3 other junior strategists, a creative director named Quincy who wore surprising socks and made very good coffee, and an assistant called Peregrine who apparently had a photographic memory and used it primarily to remember everyone's coffee orders and the precise seconds when Serafina Vale was likely to appear on any given floor. 3rd floor before 9, Peregrine told me on my 2nd day, with the seriousness of a naturalist describing the habits of a rare and dangerous animal. 8th floor at noon, always. Unless there's a board meeting, then she doesn't eat until 4, and she's... A pause. Intense. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. The work itself was interesting enough to occupy me fully when I let it. The campaign I'd been assigned to was for a new cultural initiative Vale Meridian was backing, a collaboration between 3 emerging visual artists and a heritage fashion house. Complex, prestigious, with the particular kind of pressure that comes when something is meant to look effortless but require enormous effort. I had ideas. Good ones. My team noticed, and I noticed them noticing, which was the particular warm, fuel-like satisfaction of being taken seriously after a long time of being dismissed. I saw Serafina regularly. That was, of course, inevitable. But our interactions were surgical in their professionalism. She gave direction. I received it. She reviewed my work with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to read between every line, and occasionally she made a mark in the margin of a document, a single word, a redirection, and the mark was always precisely right, which I found privately irritating and privately thrilling in equal measure. We never spoke about the note, we never spoke about the hotel bar. We maintained the terms of an unspoken agreement alongside the written one, and I told myself that was fine. That was sustainable. That was what I had signed up for. Then I went home at night to my apartment, where Nora would leave me portions of whatever she'd cooked in a container labeled with small, encouraging post-it notes, and I would sit at my small desk in my small chair and look at my city through a window that didn't begin to compare to the floor-to-ceiling glass of that hotel suite, and I thought about the way Serafina had said the coat suits you with her back to me, and I thought about how much harder it was to want something that had decided, on your behalf, that you were better off without it. I saw her life in fragments. In pieces of observation, small accumulations, the drivers who waited for her outside, the security detail that moved with her invisibly, the meetings that other people in the building referenced in tones that suggested standing too close to a fire. I overheard enough to understand that Serafina Vale had enemies, real ones, not corporate rivalry as metaphor enemies, but people who wanted her gone, who were watching for a crack in the edifice. The company was enormous and therefore enormously exposed. She had built it from something modest into something significant, and people who benefit from other people's power never quite forgive the person for having it. She was lonely. I didn't know how I knew that with such certainty from such small evidence, but I did. I'd known it that night in the hotel bar, which was probably why I'd stayed. She held herself like someone who had been alone for a long time and had trained herself to stop noticing. 6 weeks into my tenure at Vale Meridian, we had a crisis. It was 11 at night when the situation broke. I was still at the office. I often stayed late, not from performative dedication, but because the work genuinely held me, and because going home meant sitting with thoughts I was trying to outrun. When Quincy called an emergency team meeting and told us the campaign had hit a problem. One of the artists had publicly disagreed with the fashion house's creative direction in a post that had gathered enough momentum to constitute an incident. By morning, headlines would call it a collapse. Our campaign was the bridge between the two parties. If the bridge was gone, the campaign was gone. I worked through the night with my team, drafting a response strategy, reframing the narrative, finding the version of events that was both honest and constructive. By 3 a.m, we had something usable. By 4, I had refined it into something I thought was genuinely good. I was alone in the open plan office at 4:15, proofreading, when the elevator opened and Serafina stepped out. She was not in her full CEO presentation. She was in a dark blazer over what appeared to be the top of a silk blouse, and her hair, usually impeccably contained, had been pulled back more simply, with a few strands loose. She looked like someone who had been in a very long meeting and then another very long meeting and possibly hadn't been home. She stopped when she saw me. "You're still here," she said, not accusatory, just noting it, the way you'd note weather. "The campaign crisis," I said. "I put together a response brief. It's not perfect yet, but it's something to work with." She came and looked at what was on my screen. She stood close enough that I could smell her perfume again. Different from the hotel, more restrained, the office version, and I kept my eyes on the screen and breathed evenly. She read everything. She read it completely, which not everyone does. When she finished, she straightened and said, "This is very good." "Thank you." Silence. The office was as quiet as I'd ever heard it, which in a city never quite reaches silence but comes close, a low, constant hum of existing machinery. I looked up at her. She was standing very still, looking out at the city lights through the glass wall, and something in the line of her shoulders was different, less assembled, like a structure that's been holding a weight for too long and has finally privately begun to fatigue. "Are you all right?" I asked. I didn't plan to ask. It came out because it was true. She looked at me sharply, as if I'd spoken in a language she'd forgotten she knew. "There was a board meeting today," she said after a moment. "Someone I trusted, have trusted for years, voted against a decision I'd brought to protect the company's creative autonomy in exchange for an investor relationship that I believe will compromise our identity within 3 years." She paused. The words came out measured, but the pain beneath them was real. "I built this company on a particular idea about what we were for. And I sometimes wonder whether the company has grown past that idea and left me standing in the place where it used to be. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "The crisis brief I wrote, the whole argument at the center of it is that Vale Meridian's value is its perspective, that it's not just a service company, it's a point of view. That's your idea, isn't it? That's what you built." She looked at me. "That idea still lives in the work," I said. "I can see it every time I look at what this company does well. It might be worth fighting for." Another pause, longer this time. "You're very direct," she said. "You mentioned that you preferred it," I said. "In the hotel bar. You said you were exhausted by people who spoke around things instead of at them." The moment hung between us like something fragile and heavy simultaneously. Then she said very quietly, "I remember what I said in the hotel bar." "I know you do." We looked at each other across the quiet office. The city breathed below us, and I thought, there it is. The thing between us that the contract was supposed to make clean and that money never actually reaches. The thing that is still there regardless. She turned away first. "Go home and sleep," she said. "The brief is good. We'll present it tomorrow. Serafina." She stopped. I almost never used her first name at work. She turned back slightly, not fully. "You're allowed to be human," I said. "Even here." She was still for a long moment. Then she walked to the elevator and was gone. I went home and lay on my bed without sleeping until it was light enough to justify getting up again. The brief worked. The campaign was salvaged. Not perfectly, but well enough that the fashion house issued a statement and the artist walked it back and the bridge held. My team was jubilant in a restrained professional way. Quincy brought excellent pastries. Peregrine produced from nowhere a bottle of sparkling water that he treated as if it were champagne, which I found deeply endearing. Serafina sent a company-wide email acknowledging the crisis response team by name. Mine was among them. 2 days later, we were assigned to work on the gala. Vale Meridian held an annual event, a gathering of clients, collaborators, investors, and cultural figures that functioned simultaneously as a celebration, a networking apparatus, and a public declaration of the company's relevance. It was significant enough that the planning process began weeks in advance. My team had been asked to lead the brand narrative for the evening, the messaging, the aesthetic communication, the story the event would tell about who Vale Meridian was. It meant more proximity to Serafina. It meant strategy sessions in the executive suite, in conference rooms that smelled like fresh air and old money, in the glass elevator going up to levels of the building I hadn't visited before. She was professional in all of them, sharp, engaged, demanding, occasionally appreciative in the specific and reluctant way of someone who doesn't give approval lightly and therefore means it when they do. But there were cracks, small ones. A glance that lasted 1 second too long before she looked away. A moment in the elevator, just the two of us, at night going down, when the lights of the city rose in the glass around us and she looked at my reflection, instead of the floor numbers, and then, when she caught herself, looked at the ceiling. A morning when she came to the open plan with 2 cups of coffee and set one on my desk without explanation or comment, and I looked up and she was already walking away, and I looked down at the cup and thought, oh no. I was falling in love with her, not again. Not for the first time, because if I'm being rigorously honest with myself, I had started falling that night in the hotel bar, but I was falling further, faster, with more knowledge of who she was now, which made it worse, not better. Nora figured it out before I admitted it to myself. She came into my room one Sunday afternoon when I was pretending to work and sat on my bed and looked at me with the patient expression of someone who has waited for you to be ready to be honest. "Is it her?" she asked. I didn't look up from my laptop. "Is what who?" "The coat woman. Your mystery one-night person. Is she the CEO? Because you've been making this face for weeks and I've been trying to give you space to figure it out, but I'm running out of patience and also the good cheese." I closed the laptop. "Yes," I said. "She's the CEO." "Oh," said Nora. "Yes." "And you're—" "Yes." "Celeste. I know. This is very— I know that too." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, with the particular gentleness she reserved for things that mattered, "What does she want?" "I genuinely don't know. I think she might not know either, which is the most terrifying thing." Nora nodded slowly. Are you happy at the company? I love the work. Genuinely. It's the best professional experience I've had. My team is good and the projects are interesting and I feel like... I pressed a hand to my sternum, trying to locate the feeling precisely. Like I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Like I fit. Then don't blow that up, Nora said firmly. I know. But also, she pointed at me, don't shrink yourself into something small so that someone else stays comfortable. I've watched you do that your whole life and I'm tired of watching it. I thought about that for a long time after she left. The gala week arrived. The venue was a rooftop space 3 blocks from the office, open to the sky when the weather was clear, enclosed when needed, with a garden terrace that in mid-autumn still held the last stubborn green things. I'd been involved in every aspect of the narrative construction, and seeing it take physical shape around me felt like watching something private made public in the best way. The space said things I had helped it say. Serafina arrived at the event exactly when she was supposed to, which was always because she was always exactly on time, and she walked through the space with the same fluid certainty she walked everywhere, greeting people with the controlled warmth that public-facing Serafina could produce on demand. Then Livia Hart arrived. I didn't know Livia initially. I'd heard the name in office corridors with a tone that suggested complexity. She was an executive from the company's largest investment partner, older than me, impeccably presented, with a manner that suggested she had decided which room she deserved to be in and had never reconsidered. She moved directly to Serafina's side with the ease of long habit and placed her hand on Serafina's arm in a way that was public and familiar and deliberate. I watched from across the room with a glass of champagne I had stopped tasting. They spoke for a long time. Serafina's face was pleasant and professional. She didn't lean into Livia, didn't offer anything that could be called warmth, but she didn't move away either. And in the economics of public social performance at an event like this, presence was its own communication. I told myself it didn't matter. I reminded myself of the NDA. I reminded myself that whatever I thought was happening between Serafina and me was a projection built from one night and too many late evenings and glances in elevator glass. Then Serafina looked across the room and found my eyes. She found them the way you find something you've been looking for, immediately, without searching, and she held them for just long enough that I understood she'd been looking. Livia said something beside her. Serafina looked away. I set down my champagne and found the terrace and stood in the October cold with my palms flat against the stone railing and breathed in the night air and instructed myself firmly to be practical. She came out to the terrace 20 minutes later. You've been avoiding the event you planned, she said, coming to stand beside me. I've been getting air. Celeste. I turned to look at her. In the low terrace lights, in that suit, with her hair like that and the city behind her, she was extraordinary. I was very tired of being struck by that and having nowhere to put it. I saw you with Livia Hart, I said. I'm not going to make a scene or do anything awkward. I just needed a moment. Something crossed her face. Livia and I are professionally connected. We are not... A pause, precise and deliberate. Anything else. We have never been. You don't have to explain yourself to me. I'm aware that I don't. I'm doing it anyway. Her voice had dropped, and it was the voice I remembered, the voice from the hotel bar, unguarded with the full weight of someone who has decided to tell the truth. She is someone who wants something from me that I am not prepared to give. Most people in my life want something from me. You are... Another pause, longer. Categorically different in that regard. Am I? I turned to face her fully. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm the one thing you're most committed to keeping at a contractual distance. She looked at me. Her jaw was set in that particular way it had when she was suppressing something significant. That contract, she said, was not about what I wanted. It was about what I was afraid of. The night air moved between us. Somewhere below, the city made its noise. What were you afraid of? I asked. That night meant something, she said, very quietly, like someone reading something they have been holding for a long time. And I have learned, over many years and at significant cost, that things that mean something to me are the things that can be most effectively used against me. By the time I knew who you were, by the time I knew you were coming to work here, I had already failed to forget you. That is not something that happens to me. So you paid someone to take care of it. I was terrified. She said it without evasion. Not of you. Never of you. Of what it would mean, of what it would require of me. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, the money didn't hurt me. Serafina, I want you to understand that. What hurt me was thinking that you had looked at that night, at something that felt more real to me than most real things, and decided the most accurate word for it was liability. She closed her eyes briefly. It was the opposite, she said. It was precisely because it wasn't a liability that I was afraid. We stood in the autumn night with that truth between us. Then I said, don't disappear again. Whatever else, just don't do that. She opened her eyes, looked at me with all the composure stripped back, just her, the actual person, the one I'd met in the bar when the storm knocked the lights out. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Then she raised one hand and touched my face, barely, the tips of her fingers just beneath my jaw, and I felt it in every nerve ending I possessed. She leaned in slowly, deliberately, giving me every opportunity to step back, and I didn't step back, and she kissed me. It was not the desperate, storm-dark kiss of the hotel. It was something else, careful and warm and aching with restraint, the kiss of someone who has spent weeks not touching you and has finally run out of reasons to continue not doing so. I put my hand against her chest, over her sternum, and felt her heart going faster than her exterior in any way suggested. When she pulled back, we were both very still. This is complicated, she said. I know. The company, the optics. Helena is going to... I know, I said again. I know all of it. I'm still here. She looked at me for a long moment. Then the terrace door opened and someone appeared needing Serafina's attention, and she stepped back and straightened and was the CEO again with seamless, practiced ease. But she glanced at me once more before she turned, and it was a glance that said, this isn't finished. It was a glance that said, I will come back. She did come back, but not before things got worse. I don't know who saw us on the terrace. I don't know if anyone did. But gossip in a company like Vale Meridian moved through particular channels, not bulletin boards or water cooler conversations, but the careful, pointed murmur of people who understood the value of information. Within a week, there were looks, small ones, the kind that stop when you enter a room and resume when you leave it. Peregrine warned me in his oblique way that some people were talking about some things, and I should be careful. Then Helena Cross appeared at my desk. She sat across from me with a folder I recognized, the kind that contained paperwork, and she said calmly that she wanted to discuss the terms of my professional positioning going forward. She said that certain optics were creating difficulties for the company's external reputation management. She said it would be in my best interest, professionally and personally, to consider whether my current role created unnecessary complications. I listened to all of this without interrupting. Then I said, "Are you asking me to resign?" "I'm asking you to consider what's best for everyone. I'm the only person in this conversation who's managing both their career and someone else's anxiety about it," I said, "and I think you know I'm not the source of the problem." Helena's eyes sharpened. "You're a junior employee who spent one night with the company's CEO and now believes—" "I believe," I said, keeping my voice very even, "that I'm an excellent strategist who has done excellent work since the day I arrived, and that the campaign crisis response I single-handedly rebuilt at 4 a.m. probably kept this company from a very bad headline. I signed the NDA. I have been entirely professional. If there are rumors, they didn't start with me." She left without the outcome she'd come for, but the encounter shook me in the way that injustice always does, not because I was surprised by it, but because I was exhausted by it. I had spent my entire career being told, in one form or another, that I was a complication rather than a contribution, that my presence created problems rather than solving them, and I'd fought it every time quietly, determinedly with my work, but fighting it is different from not being wounded by it. Serafina found out what Helena had done. I didn't tell her. I'm certain Peregrine did, because Peregrine was, in his quiet way, something of a moral weather vane for the executive floor. 2 days later, Helena appeared to have been reassigned from any matters relating to marketing department personnel. I would have felt more straightforwardly gratified about that if things hadn't started falling apart immediately afterward. The investor rumors began circulating. Someone had leaked something, not the NDA, not the specifics, but enough. A gossip column the company's PR team monitored published a vague but pointed paragraph about a power differential relationship at a major media firm. It didn't name names, but it didn't need to, not for the people who worked inside the building or moved in those professional circles. Serafina came to find me in the open plan office one morning. She sat in the chair across from my desk and spoke quietly, looking at her hands. "I need to ask you something difficult," she said. "Ask. Would you be willing to be transferred to the external creative advisory team? Independent contractor status, same compensation, better project autonomy, no direct line to my office." She looked up. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to move somewhere they can't use you as a weapon." I looked at her for a long time. "This is you protecting me," I said. "Yes. And also removing yourself from the situation before it costs you something." A pause. Both things can be true simultaneously. "Serafina," I leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to be shuffled away again. I've spent my entire life being moved out of sight when I became inconvenient, and I'm done with it." She closed her eyes briefly. I know that, and I'm not. But I'll think about the advisory role," I said, "on its own merits, not as a solution to your PR situation. If it's a better professional position with real autonomy and interesting work, I'll consider it honestly, but I need it to be offered to me as a person with a career, not as a problem being managed." She was quiet for a moment. "That is what I meant it to be," she said. "I did it badly." "Yes. I do a lot of things badly when I'm afraid." "I've noticed." The ghost of something crossed her face, the almost smile. Then Livia Hart walked into the office. She came in with the bearing of someone who had been told she could, which meant she had obtained permission from someone at the executive level, which meant she was there deliberately and with purpose. She spoke to 2 people at the far end of the room and then turned and saw us, and something in her expression went smooth and calculated. "Serafina," she said pleasantly, coming over, "I didn't know you were down here today." "Livia." Serafina's voice was even. "This isn't a good moment." "Of course." She looked at me. The look was polished and dismissive and communicative in the way that certain types of power like to be communicative. "You are small and you know it, and I am confirming it for both of us." "You must be the strategist who handled the campaign crisis. I heard the brief was impressive." "Thank you," I said. I kept my voice pleasant. "I've been telling Serafina she should integrate more of the junior creative talent more closely into the executive strategy conversations. It's good for the company culture." She smiled. "How are you finding it here?" "Exceptional," I said. "The work is excellent and the people are generally very good." Livia smiled again, not warmly. Then she said something to Serafina about a meeting and departed. I looked at Serafina. "She knows," I said. "Yes. And she's going to use it." "Probably." Serafina looked after Livia with an expression that was not fear but was adjacent to it. She has access to enough of the right people, if she decides it's useful. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "What would happen? If it came out, what would actually happen?" "Investor concern, board scrutiny. The narrative would be not flattering for either of us, but particularly for the company's governance image." She said it carefully. "And you would be the one called the distraction." I felt the familiar weight of that, the particular injustice of being the less powerful person in a power narrative. "Right," I said. She looked at me. Something in her face was very honest. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry that you're in a position where someone can use you as a tool against me, and that is not fair to you, and that I created it." "You didn't create it alone," I said. "I was there too. You didn't know who I was." "No, but I knew who you were." I said it quietly. The person, not the title, and I chose her anyway. Serafina was very still. Then she stood up and said, "The advisory role proposal is formally on your desk by Friday. Read it carefully and tell me what you want changed." I said I would. She left, and I sat at my desk and thought about storms and hotel bars, and how sometimes the most honest things happen in the dark when the city's lights go out and you have nothing to prove to anyone. The shareholder meeting was in November, a large formal event at a hotel ballroom in the business district, the kind of gathering where everyone wore their most expensive version of professional and the air smelled like money and controlled anxiety. I was not invited, I wasn't a shareholder or an executive, but I was in the building, working in a side conference room with 2 colleagues on a quarterly report presentation. I knew Serafina would be speaking. I knew the board had been difficult. I knew there were forces within the company's investor structure who were looking for the kind of vulnerability that could justify restructuring the executive leadership. Helena Cross had been part of that apparatus, and though she'd been moved sideways, she hadn't been moved out. Livia was there. She had been there all week, meeting with board members individually, which Peregrine had reported with the gravity of a weather forecast indicating severe conditions. I was in the conference room reviewing slides when Peregrine appeared in the doorway, slightly pale. "Ms. Rowan," he said, "you might want—" He stopped. "Ms. Hart has raised something in the shareholders' session. It's—" He pressed his lips together. "It's about you. Not directly, but it's about you." I stood up. What Livia had done, I learned as I moved toward the ballroom, was this. She had raised the question of internal relationship transparency in connection with a senior leadership figure and a junior team member in a way that was deniable enough to avoid being a direct accusation but pointed enough to land. It was the kind of political move that didn't leave fingerprints. It put the information in the room without technically putting it there. I stood outside the ballroom doors and thought about what I was about to do. I had choices. I could stay outside, I could go home, I could transfer to the advisory role and put a professional ocean between myself and all of this. I could be sensible. Then I thought about Nora's voice. Don't shrink yourself into something small so that someone else stays comfortable. I pushed the doors open. The room was formal and large and very full. I walked in during a moment of transition between speakers, which meant I was visible, obviously not a shareholder, obviously not someone who'd been expected, and heads turned. Serafina was at the front of the room. She saw me come in and went very still. Livia was at a table near the front. She saw me too. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, recalculation. Then Serafina spoke. She was at the podium and she had been about to respond to a board question about the company's governance structure, and she pivoted. Smoothly. The way that people who have spent decades presenting do. Without visible seams. "I want to address something directly," she said, "because directness is something I believe in and something this company was built on." Her voice was even and strong and filled the room. In recent days, questions have been raised, obliquely in the way that questions in rooms like this sometimes prefer to be oblique, about a personal connection involving my leadership and a member of the creative team. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's being implied. She paused. I will say this. The individual in question is one of the most talented strategists I've had the privilege of watching work in this company. Her professional integrity has been exemplary. Her contributions have been significant and demonstrable. Any narrative that attempts to reduce her to a footnote in someone else's agenda is not accurate, not fair, and not something I'm willing to allow to stand unaddressed. Another pause. Vale Meridian's leadership will be evaluated on its results, its decisions, and its values. Not on the personal lives of the people who work here. That applies to everyone in this room. The silence that followed was the particular kind that follows something that has landed. Then Livia's voice measured from her table. Serafina, I think we should move forward, Serafina said. Unless you'd like to officially enter a motion that I have a specific conflict of interest, which you are procedurally entitled to do, in which case I'll invite the board council to discuss the full legal parameters, and we can spend the next 3 hours doing that instead of reviewing the fourth quarter projection, which I think is a more productive use of everyone's time. Livia said nothing. The meeting continued. I stood near the back of the room until it ended. When people began to move and disperse, I didn't go to Serafina. I stood where I was, in the back, with my hands at my sides, and when her eyes found mine across the room, I simply looked at her with everything I had. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then the board members surrounded her and she was absorbed into the professional machinery again, and I went back to the conference room, and I sat down at my desk and I pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed until my heartbeat steadied. Peregrine appeared with tea I hadn't asked for and said, very quietly, "That was quite something, Miss Rowan." "Yes," I said, "it was." I transferred to the external advisory role in January. It was not a retreat. I want to be clear about that, and clearer still that Serafina and I were clear about it too. We talked. We talked in the way that two adults who have survived a great deal of mutual complication can eventually talk, directly, sometimes painfully, with the lights on and the defensive layers temporarily aside. The advisory role was genuinely excellent, independent, project-based, well-compensated. It let me build something that was mine, a portfolio, a reputation that was legible to the industry as belonging to me and not as a subset of someone else's story. By March, I had taken on 2 additional clients through word of mouth. By April, Nora had moved in with her girlfriend, and I had rented a slightly less small apartment and bought my own excellent coat, though I still kept the black cashmere one folded in my closet. Serafina and I navigated those months carefully. There were dinners, real ones, not hotel bar collisions or conference room encounters, but deliberate, chosen meals in quiet restaurants where neither of us was performing. She told me things she apparently did not routinely tell people. I learned the specifics of her loneliness. Not the abstract CEO version, but the actual lived texture of it. She had few people she trusted deeply, and trust was not something she extended easily, or quickly, or without cost. What she offered me was incremental and genuine, and I valued it more for that. She was learning, I think, that I was not going to use her honesty as leverage, that the things she told me in the quiet would stay there, that being seen by someone did not have to mean being exposed. And I was learning, I think, that someone can be powerful and protective and intimidating to the world and still trembling slightly in the dark, still needing to be told that they are allowed to want things. In April, she asked me to come back to the hotel. Not to stay, not with any of the original fraught circumstances. She asked me to meet her at the bar, the same one where the storm had found us, where I had sat with a glass of wine and she had walked in from the rain and we had recognized each other in the way you sometimes recognize strangers, beneath the level of facts, as if they've been missing from somewhere in your life and have just come back. I wore the black coat. I don't know if that was deliberate. It was. I got there first this time, which felt significant. I sat at the same high bar with a glass of the same wine, and I watched the door, and when she came in, also coat, darker, a deep navy, face open in the way I'd learned to read as deliberately open, as her choosing to be seen. She stopped when she saw me and something crossed her face that was warm and tender and almost undone, and I thought, there, that's the face. That's the one she keeps for private. She came and sat beside me. "Hello," she said. "Hello," I said. We looked at each other. "No storm tonight," she said. The sky outside the windows was clear, just city lights and the first generous warmth of spring. "No storm," I agreed. A pause. Comfortable this time. Settled. "I've been thinking," she said, wrapping both hands around a glass the bartender had produced before she'd ordered, because it was the kind of bar that knew its regulars, about what I said to you that night. The first one. Which part? That the night was the most honest thing I'd permitted myself in years. She turned the glass slightly. I wanted to revise that. I waited. What I should have said, she continued, was that it was the first time in years that I'd been in a room with someone and felt that I didn't need to manage what was happening, that it could just be happening. She looked at me. I haven't felt that in a very long time, Celeste. It terrified me, and I handled my terror badly. You did, I said. You really did. I know. The NDA. I know. The money. I know. And then, I said, you made a speech in a shareholders' meeting that was essentially... Don't, she said, and the almost smile was there, pronounced now, nearly actual. Don't make it a speech. It was a speech, I said, a very good one. She looked at me with those eyes, older than mine, steadier, marked with everything they'd seen and survived, and said very quietly, I meant it, all of it. You are not something I am ashamed of. You are not a mistake or a liability or a problem I'm solving. You are the first person in years who has made me believe it might be possible to want something and not have it used against me. And I realize that's an enormous amount to put on you, but I'm trying to say what's true instead of only what's manageable. I set my glass down. Then let me say something true, I said. I've been in love with you since a hotel bar during a power outage, which is honestly a mortifying thing to have to admit. I signed your NDA and went home and cried into your coat, which is even more mortifying. I showed up to work every day knowing you were 2 floors above me, and I performed complete professional normalcy while being completely undone, and I want you to understand what that cost me, because it was not nothing. She was very still. But I'm here, I said. I'm here by choice and not by contract, and I'm not going anywhere. And I need you to stop finding elegant ways to leave, because I am tired of being the one who stays, and you're the one who goes. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Her voice was very low. I told you that on the terrace. I know, I'm reminding you. She reached across the bar and took my hand. Just that, her fingers over mine, deliberate and warm. She held my hand like it was something she had decided to hold, not something she had fallen into, and that distinction mattered to me more than I could have articulated at the time. Stay, she said. I intend to, I said. She raised my hand and pressed her lips to my knuckles, formal and old-fashioned and entirely privately hers, a gesture she'd never have made anywhere else. And I felt the evening expand around us like something finally given space to breathe. Later, months later, when the seasons had turned again and the city had cycled through its various moods, we were in the rooftop garden above her office building at sunrise. She had taken me up there for the first time in the summer, sheepishly, in the way that people show you places they're privately proud of. It was extraordinary, a deliberate wilderness above the glass and steel, planted with things that shouldn't technically grow that high up but did, apparently out of sheer stubbornness. There were benches. There was a small table with 2 chairs. There was a view of the harbor that at sunrise turned colors I could not name adequately. We went there often after that, early mornings sometimes. The building was barely populated before 7, and the garden was entirely ours. No assistants, no legal officers, no investors, no cameras, no narratives being managed. She was standing at the railing with her coffee looking at the harbor. I was sitting on the bench. She was wearing less than her usual corporate precision, a dark sweater, soft trousers, her hair loose, in the way I had come to think of as real, as the version that was just her and not the presentation. I want to say something, she said, not turning around. Say it, I said. She turned, looked at me with that face, the open one, the private one. In the early light, she was extraordinary in a way that had nothing to do with elegance or wealth or power, and everything to do with being present and choosing to be. I love you, she said, simply, without preamble or qualification. I know we haven't said it, and I know there's no version of saying it that isn't terrifying to me, but I believe it's true, and I believe you deserve to hear it said plainly. I set down my coffee. I got up and went to her, and she stood very still as I approached, like someone who had made a declaration and was now waiting to see what the world did with it. I took her face in my hands, carefully, the way you hold something important, and I kissed her in the sunrise above the harbor, and she exhaled into the kiss, with the full, specific relief of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time. I love you too, I said against her mouth. I've been loving you since before I knew your name. It's been genuinely inconvenient. She laughed, a real one, low and surprised, and it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard from her because she didn't perform it for anyone. She put her arms around me, and we stood there in the rooftop garden above the city in the early morning with the harbor going gold below us, and I thought about a hotel bar in a storm and a note on a pillow and a black cashmere coat and all the strange, winding, complicated, impractical miles between that morning and this one. No contract between us. No money, no managed silence, just 2 people who had chosen repeatedly through fear and difficulty and the full inconvenient weight of wanting each other to stay. She pressed her mouth to my temple. I felt her smile against my skin. The city woke up below us, unhurried, beginning its ordinary day, and we stayed exactly where we were.